Okay, so again, I'm Brad Wybro with Altin Technologies, and today we're going to talk about ways to give MDaemon a tune-up. In other words, we'll talk about some things that you can do to improve MDaemon's performance. We'll talk about hardware-based things you can do, as well as configuration options you have for improving performance. We'll also go over some recommended security settings for best results with your security processes. So if there are any questions, feel free to use the chat feature, or if you have questions afterwards, you are certainly welcome to email me at training@altin.com. So we'll talk about things you can do to improve MDaemon's performance, including hardware and system recommendations, hard drive recommendations, things like that. We'll talk about configuration via the software to help improve performance, and we'll go over spam filter and security settings as well. So we want to go over some important initial recommendations first to help you get the best performance. First of all, we recommend that you use the latest version of MDaemon, because in later versions of MDaemon, new security and performance features have been added, as well as we recommend using the latest Security Plus. Security Plus is another product we have that works in conjunction with MDaemon and provides 2 extra layers of security. It provides a signature-based antivirus engine with automatic updates. So it will scan your inbound and outbound email messages for viruses, and it also includes outbreak protection provided by Siren, which will filter email based on worldwide patterns that it detects in real time. We also recommend using the Bayesian learning feature, which allows you to basically train the spam filter to become more accurate over time by feeding it samples of spam and non-spam messages. And we've got some best practices on that we'll talk about throughout this lesson as well. Also, it's beneficial to have a dedicated connection with the static IP address as opposed to a dynamic IP or a non-dedicated or dial-up connection. When you use a dedicated static connection with a static IP, and when you use direct SMTP delivery with a single MX record, then the emails will contain all of the headers and content that are necessary to filter upon to make your security features more effective. If you're collecting mail via domain pop through a catch-all account, in most cases, domain pop reduces MDaemon's ability to detect unwanted spam and virus-infected messages, because a number of MDaemon security features will rely on it being able to see the connecting IP as well as the rate of incoming connections. And it also needs to verify the sender's address, to validate the recipient's address, and to check the content and distribution patterns before accepting or rejecting a message during the SMTP session. So when you're collecting mail via domain pop, some of that information will not be available and can make your spam filter processes a little bit less effective. Also, make sure the proper ports are open on your firewall to allow inbound and outbound traffic. So the first thing we'll get into is improving performance. And one of the things you'll want to consider, and you would want to consider this when installing MDaemon initially as well, is how many users do you have? And what are the sizes of those users' mailboxes, or the files stored within their mailboxes? So if you have a lot of users, or if we have a lot of users sending large attachments, that could have an effect on performance. We recommend using faster hard drives with MDaemon, because MDaemon is very input-output intensive, I/O intensive. It does a lot of reading and writing to the hard drive, so a faster drive is recommended. Also, we recommend that you defragment at a regular basis. I have mine configured to defragment once or twice a week, but you may want to defragment at different intervals depending on how much traffic you have and how much fragmentation is taking place. It's beneficial, especially in high traffic environments, to have multiple hard drives serving different purposes. You can have, for example, all of your mail stored on one drive while having all of your public folders and queues and logs stored on separate drives. And the way to make that happen is, so let's say you have several different hard drives, whether they be local on the MDaemon machine or at a mapped via a network drive. If you map a drive letter to another drive, then you can open up the mdaemon.ini file, which is located inside the MDaemon app directory. And there's a section in that file that begins with the word directories. And as you can see here, we have various different directories for the various queues, for example, the local queue, remote queue. You have a directory for the holding queue. There's a directory for your public folders. There's a directory for your backup, for your Bayesian learning, for your mail archives, and things like that. So you can change the lines in this file with the drive letter designations of any other drives that you wish to use. And this can greatly improve performance because now you'll have several drives working in conjunction at the same time, and they can read and write at the same time. So it's a good way to improve performance. This information is available on our website under the Products tab, under the MDaemon Products page, under System Recommendations. So you can use this as a guideline based on the number of users you will be hosting or supporting. And again, I won't go over all this in too much detail, but the more users you have, the more RAM you would want to use for best results. And we would recommend the hard drives that match the specifications shown here. Another thing that you can do to improve MDaemon's performance is to enable the attachment linking feature. So what this does is for inbound and outbound emails that have an attachment linking will remove the attachment from the email and place it in a centrally located directory, and then replace that attachment with a link that the recipient can click on in that email message. And this helps, of course, to lower the message delivery size and lower bandwidth usage as well. And this can also help minimize the chance that a message is rejected due to its message size. So again, the attachment is stripped from the message, stored in a centrally located directory on the MDaemon server. The link is placed in the email message itself. The recipient receives that email, clicks on that link to download the message accordingly. So to enable the attachment linking feature, there are two screens that I'm going to show you. The first one is located under the Setup menu under Web and IM Services, and this is where you go to enable it globally, to enable the actual feature itself. And when you select the option that I'm pointing at on the screen to let World Client automatically manage attachment linking, it'll store attachments inside the MDaemon attachments directory. There will be a folder for each domain and a folder for each mailbox. That's why we're using the domain mailbox macros in this URL reference, because that will vary depending on what your domain is and the name of your mailbox. So it'll store them there. You can optionally use the options on the bottom half of this screen if you'd like to store those attachments somewhere else. Now, the other half of this is enabling the feature for each user. So to do that, you would go to the account editor for that specific user, and then you would select one of these options on this screen. For example, extract attachments and put them in the accounts documents folder, or use the attachment linking feature as I have shown here. So those were the recommendations that I would make for improving MDaemon's performance. Now the rest of this presentation is going to focus more on security and recommended security settings, and there are a number of settings we'll go through here. Now, this is just an overview of the standard defense layers or security processes that an email message passes through before MDaemon accepts the message. So it'll go through IP screening, host screening, reverse lookups, IP shielding, and so forth. All of these items listed: tarpitting, gray listing, DNS blacklist, DKIM, DMARC, and spam filtering. And I'll explain what many of these mean throughout this presentation. We'll go over more detail for the most recommended ones that we recommend. Also, if you have Security Plus installed, you'll get two additional layers of security. You'll get the inline virus scanning via the Kaspersky antivirus engine, and also the Siren outbreak protection, which are two extra layers of security added when you install Security Plus. So first of all, let's talk about your spam filter scoring options. So this is the spam filter configuration screen, the main screen you go to when you select spam filter under the security menu. And you notice you've got some scoring options here. When spam arrives at when an email message arrives into the MDaemon server, it is first scanned at the SMTP level when it first arrives. And a score, it is assessed a score based on the testing it goes through at that time. At that time, if it scores a 12 or above, 12 points or above, it will be rejected at the SMTP level. If, on the other hand, it scores less than 12, it will be allowed to pass through another scan called what we call a queue-based scan, and further tests will be performed on it, and then the spam score will be adjusted accordingly. At that time, it is possible for a message to score, say, 11 points or even 4 points at the SMTP level, and then pass on to the queue-based scan, at which point its score is updated. Now, at that time, it is possible for that message to score more than 12 points. However, if it scores a 5 or above, 5 points or above, then it is treated according to the settings that you have on the bottom half of this window. Now, notice the checkbox that I'm pointing at with that left arrow on the left-hand side, skip queue-based scan on messages processed during the SMTP session. I would not recommend checking that box. I would recommend unchecking it so that your spam filter can be more accurate. This may put a little bit more work on the CPU, but that would be negligible, really, and it's recommended that you uncheck that box. And then on the next slide, we'll talk about what happens with spam messages. One thing to think about is, okay, so do you want to delete the message? Do you want to flag it and let it continue down the delivery path? And we'll talk about those options here. So by default, when MDaemon detects a spam email, it'll flag it and add a spam tagline score to the message subject before allowing it to continue down the delivery path to the end user. Now, in most cases, it's actually preferable to filter messages flagged as spam into a spam trap public folder, which can be monitored for false positives by the administrator. And we'll talk about how to do that later on in this lesson. So to enable this to happen, we select the middle option in the state of spam section at the bottom, shown here, to flag the message and let it continue down, or excuse me, to put it in the spam trap folder. So in high traffic servers, having somebody monitor the spam trap folder could be time consuming. So let's say, for example, you have 1,000 users who each receive 10 spam messages a day. That's 10,000 spam messages that you might have to go through. So what you could do, instead of putting them in the spam trap public folder for monitoring by the administrator, is flag the messages and let them continue down the delivery path. Now, when you flag them, of course, it's going to flag the subject with a series of characters that you can use IMAP filters or the content filter to filter on. Or, and I'll show you in the following screen here, you can move those messages into the user's IMAP spam folder automatically and let those users filter out or discard spam messages accordingly. So for higher traffic environments, this would be the recommended setup to take some of the workload off of the administrator. Now, the administrator can log into remote administration and click on the spam trap queue here to determine what to do with messages that are placed in the spam trap. Now, this is for the global administrator. You must have global administrator rights to access this screen. And what you can do on this screen, I only have one message in here because this is on a test server, but if you have multiple messages, you can sort the listing by score with the ones that scored the lowest at the top. That would allow you to whitelist or release any messages that may have been falsely tagged as spam, so any false positives. So you can delete the message, you can release it for delivery, you can select the re-queue button to send it back through the mail queues and send it on its way. Now, to access remote administration, normally you'd go to your host name at port 1000. By default, remote administration runs on port 1000, but this URL may vary depending on whether you are using an SSL connection or you've changed your port designations. But by default, remote administration runs on port 1000. So one of the things to consider is, when it comes to whitelisting, there are different things to think about. First of all, you've got different whitelist options. You've got whitelist no filtering, whitelist by recipient, and whitelist by sender. Now, the whitelist no filtering option, when you have an address or domain on that list, it will not be passed through the spam filter at all. However, if you have an item listed under whitelist by recipient or whitelist by sender, by default, 100 points are subtracted from the spam score of that message. Now, be careful when you're whitelisting an address that you do not add any local domains or local addresses to that list. If somebody spoofed your domain and you have your domain whitelisted, then that could allow them to send spam into your server. Likewise, we have the blacklist. So the blacklist by sender will add 100 points to the message's overall score for messages that are from any addresses or domains listed here. Now, because spammers generally don't use their own email addresses when sending spam, then blacklisting the address that they've spoofed may not generally or greatly reduce spam. So if you're getting false positives also, by the way, make sure that the sender wasn't accidentally blacklisted. So the recommended use that I would suggest for the blacklist by sender is to blacklist legitimate addresses that you don't want to receive mail from. So let's say, for example, you're receiving marketing emails from a particular address or annoying sales emails and things like that. You can blacklist those addresses here. So again, by default, when a message arrives for somebody on a whitelist or a blacklist, 100 points are either added or subtracted from the message score by default. This setting is the default setting and typically works well for most environments. You can change this if you'd like to do so, but it's not recommended. We also recommend enabling DNS blacklists. So the DNS blacklist feature checks the IP address of incoming SMTP connections against publicly hosted IP-based blacklists. And so we would recommend configuring the default settings shown here. By default, Spamhaus is the blacklist that we have, the blacklist provider that we have listed. They may have certain criteria that you should meet before being allowed to use them. However, most of the MDaemon installations will meet those criteria, but you can review their criteria via their website via the URL shown here at the bottom of your screen. So by default, MDaemon will check DNS blacklists for IP addresses within received headers on SMTP and POP collected mail. So these boxes are checked by default, and we recommend that you have those checked. And then by default, when a connecting IP address is found on a blacklist, MDaemon will add 3 points to the spam score of the message. And by checking this box, you can optionally refuse messages from blacklisted IPs as well. So now we'll talk about how you can train your spam filter to recognize spam and to become more accurate over time using the Bayesian classification feature. So this feature, the Bayesian classification engine, is enabled by default. And so what it allows you to do basically is feed it samples of spam and samples of non-spam messages. And it will feed those messages, it'll break apart their contents and feed those contents to a database of what we call tokens, so snippets of information or snippets of text taken from those messages, and the database gets built up. So by default, the Bayesian learning process takes place at midnight each night. However, if you accumulate a large number of messages to learn from, then you may want to configure Bayesian learning to take place more frequently, say, for example, every 4 hours, for example. Now, you can uncheck the option to schedule Bayesian learning at midnight each night, and then just configure Bayesian learning to take place at regular intervals accordingly. So you can uncheck the box, and then the text box will become available in the blank below that, where you can enter a number to designate the number of hours to perform the process. The default maximum message size for Bayesian analysis is 50 kilobytes. messages larger than this value will not be analyzed. Now this does help minimize the resources needed during the learning process because large messages take longer to learn from than smaller messages. And I mean, typically most spam messages are not that big, so this might help in terms of lowering system resources needed to run the process. Messages need to be supplied to the Bayesian engine. So using the options shown here, you can designate a folder for spam messages and a non-spam message folder as well, and these folders will be scanned during the learning process. Messages learned from will add to the token database. Each time a message is learned from, it's the contents of it are broken apart into tokens and fed to this token database. And once the message is learned from, then those messages are deleted from these folders. Now, the easiest way to access these Bayesian folders is by using IMAP or World Client, or you can use Outlook Connector as well. And you can feed messages to these folders by using drag and drop or by using the copy feature in World Client or via your IMAP email client. Now, as the administrator, one of the things you want to take into consideration is if you're allowing your users to drag and drop messages into these folders, how do you know that they are not putting the wrong messages in the wrong folders? So let's say, for example, one of my users accidentally put a spam message in the non-spam folder. Well, there's a way to get around that as an administrator. What you could do is remove the user's access rights to the Bayesian spam and non-spam folders so that only you can access those folders. And then just create 2 more public folders and grant users access to those instead and call those folders spam and non-spam. That way you can review the contents of those folders as the administrator, and then you can feed those messages to the Bayesian spam and non-spam engines accordingly. Users can also, by enabling the box shown here, you can enable forwarding addresses basically. And so what it allows users to do is forward spam and non-spam messages as an attachment via an authenticated session to hamlearn at your domain or spamlearn at your domain. So that's an easy way to allow users to feed the Bayesian learning process by simply emailing the message as an attachment to those addresses. There's also a way to automate the Bayesian learning process. However, I would recommend, you can enable this feature, but before you do so, I would recommend that you first analyze your anti-spam logs and see what messages are scoring, what scores they are being assigned, and see how prevalent false negatives and false positives are, because that will affect the scoring options that you provide here. For example, the default setting for non-spam email is 0.1 points, and the default setting for spam is 12 points. So in other words, it will automatically learn as spam any messages that score 12 points or above, or it will automatically learn as non-spam any messages with 0.1 points or below. So again, just make sure that messages are scoring properly before you enable this feature, but it can help automate that process and lower your workload. The Bayes database. So spam and non-spam samples are fed to a database of tokens, which are basically snippets of text taken from spam and non-spam samples. MDaemon will remove old tokens by default. Now this helps to limit the size of the database and keeps the database fresh. Now a smaller, more up-to-date database may be more effective than a larger out-of-date database. So keep that in mind as well when you enable these features. Spam honeypots are email addresses which act as a trap or a honey trap for spammers so that their spam can then be fed to MDaemon's Bayesian learning engine. Now we recommend using an email address that is dedicated solely for the purpose of collecting spam. You can post this address to a message board of some kind or some public location, and hopefully bots will collect it and start sending spam to it, which are then automatically fed directly to the Bayesian learning engine. So the address you place here should never be used for legitimate email. This is not an address that is assigned to any user. It's strictly used for the purposes of harvesting spam for the Bayesian learning engine. So now we're going to talk about ways to prevent forged messages and abuse using multiple methods, such as preventing spoofing, using SPF, DKIM, DMARC, and those features will be discussed now. So first of all, SPF. When we recommend enabling SPF, which stands for Sender Policy Framework, SPF uses a DNS record to specify what hosts are allowed to send mail for a given domain. So when you enable this feature, MDaemon will query the SPF record of the domain taken from the mail from header and then compare the connecting IP address with the IP address that's listed in the SPF record. Now, if no match is found, then it's likely that the from header was spoofed, and then the spam score is then adjusted upward for messages that fail SPF lookups. And we do have a knowledge base article on our website that goes into this in greater detail, but we do recommend enabling the SPF verification feature to check SPF records on incoming connections. Then we have domain keys identified mail. So domain keys identified mail is another email validation method that can be used to verify that an incoming message had not been altered in any way. So when this feature is enabled and an incoming message has been signed by DKIM, MDaemon will retrieve the public key from the DNS record of the domain taken from the signature and then use that key to test the message's DKIM signature to determine its validity. So if it passes the verification test, then the message will be allowed to continue on to the next step in the delivery process. Also, if the domain taken from the signature appears on the approved list, and there's a link to that in the left-hand menu as well, then the message's spam score will be lowered. If a message has no signature, or if the signature is invalid, then MDaemon will do a DNS query for what we call the ADSP record. That stands for Author Domain Signing Practices of that domain, of the domain taken from the from header, to determine whether or not all of that domain's messages should be signed by DKIM. If the ADSP record indicates that a valid signature is required, and the public key indicates that the signer is not merely testing DKIM, then the message will receive a failed result and then be handled accordingly, such as rejected or having its spam score adjusted upward. Now, because a lot of spammers now have started to use SPF or signing messages with DKIM, then just the fact that a message is signed and verified is no guarantee that you won't consider it to be spam, even though it does ensure that the message originated from a valid source. And so for this reason, the message's spam score will not be lowered as a result of SPF or DKIM verification unless the domain taken from the signature is on the approved list. So when you click on the approved list, you can add the signature here, and you've got various different tags that you can add to each entry to customize the behavior for each one. And one of the newer features we had added is DMARC. It stands for Domain-Based Message Authentication Reporting and Conformance. So DMARC is the most recent email authentication method to prevent email abuse. It expands SPF and DKIM by removing the guesswork from the receiver's message handling process to help determine if a message aligns with what the receiver knows about the sender. So in other words, if a message claiming to come from my domain fails SPF or DKIM, or both, my DMARC record will tell you how I want you to handle those messages. Do I want you to accept the message, quarantine, or reject the message? We've got a lot more information about that on our website. There's a knowledge base article on it, and also there's a webinar that I did a while back on DMARC that's on under our support tab under webinars that talks a little bit more about DMARC, how to deploy it, deployment scenarios and strategies, and DMARC records, how to read them, and how to customize them to your benefit. So now we'll talk about ways to avoid being blacklisted. The initial requirements are we recommend that you have a PTR record, which allows others to do a reverse lookup on messages claiming to come from you. We recommend that you require SMTP authentication, that you disable the relaying feature, and enable the IP shielding feature. So for SMTP authentication, that's under the Security Settings menu located here. we recommend that you have this box checked. Authentication is always required when mail is from local accounts. So this will require your users to authenticate. This also means that they would need to configure their mail client for SMTP authentication, but again, it can help keep you off of a blacklist. Also, block relaying attempts with the relay control screen. Then notice the 3 boxes that are checked here. Those are the boxes that are checked by default. Do not allow message relaying. SMTP mail address must exist if it uses a local domain. SMTP RCPT address must exist if it uses a local domain. So definitely I would recommend that you make sure this is enabled and that these boxes are checked to avoid being an open relay. It's not really recommended that you configure or check any of the exceptions on the screen. You can, but keep in mind that that might lower the effectiveness of this feature. You can also help block spoofing with the IP shield. So what the IP shield does is it allows you to designate what IP addresses are allowed to send email on behalf of a domain. In other words, let's say my domain is example.com, and I have a range of IP addresses on my local LAN. Well, I can put my local domain here, and then tell it which IP addresses are associated with that local domain. So any mail coming from my domain must have come from an IP address on my LAN. Now, you may ask, well, what about those users who are connecting from outside? Well, you can configure exceptions. You can check the boxes below to not apply the IP shield to authenticated sessions or do not apply it to trusted IPs. So this allows you to cut down on spoofing as well and abuse. So I recommend enabling this feature with the settings shown here. And yes, that don't apply to authenticated sessions, so that's what I was just referring to. So we'll talk about some other security settings that we can enable as well that we recommend. We recommend that you require strong passwords, and that's under the account options screen via the accounts menu in MDaemon. So you'll want to check the box to require strong passwords and make sure that your users are using this feature. You can also edit the bad passwords file. So if you don't want to allow any variations of the word password or any variations of the word let me in, you can put that information, you can put those entries into the bad passwords file accordingly. We also recommend that you make sure MDaemon is configured to perform reverse lookups on incoming connections. The default settings shown here are the recommended settings, and you can check the box, send 501 and close the connection on forged identification. But it's not recommended because it is common for mail servers to identify themselves with values that do not match their IP address. But we do recommend that you perform a PCR lookup on all incoming connections. Also, you can optionally exempt authenticated sessions by checking the box, exempt authenticated sessions, lookup will defer after mail. So you can check this box if you'd like to exempt those authenticated sessions. We also recommend that you enable the TLS and SSL services and also make sure that you have a certificate in the box below. You can create a self-signed certificate, which is perfectly acceptable, or you can import a third-party certificate from a trusted certificate authority. Now, if you're using a self-signed certificate, just keep in mind that users may be asked whether or not they want to proceed, and then they'll be prompted to install the certificate. Say, for example, if they're connecting via World Client and via an HTTPS secure connection. They'll be asked if they want to proceed and install the certificate, but that should only happen once. But that will not happen if you are using if you import a certificate from a third-party certificate authority. Dynamic screening also is something I recommend that you enable, and it allows you to block connections based on the activity by the connection or by the user. So, for example, you can block IPs that connect more than a given time in a given time frame. You can block IPs that fail a given number of authentication attempts. So if somebody's trying to guess one of your user's passwords, three attempts is the default value. You can block IPs that cause a failed number of RCPTs. In other words, they're trying to guess recipients and then get the recipients wrong. You can block those after a given number of failed attempts. And optionally, IPs that send a given number of RSET commands. So sometimes they'll send an RSET or a reset command to try to keep a session open a little bit longer while they try different methods to get in to your server. You can block those attempts by putting a limit there. And by default, IPs are blocked for 10 minutes. You can change that value as well. And then you can also optionally close the session after a connection is blocked. You can close the session. We also recommend that you enable account hijack detection. Now, what this does is sends a given number of messages via an authenticated session within a given time frame. It's possible that somebody had managed to guess the credentials of the account. If they managed to send 500 email messages in 30 minutes, for example. So you can use hijack detection to cut down on that or to prevent that. Once the threshold is reached, the account will be frozen or disabled, and the administrator can be notified as well. And then the administrator can notify the user that they need to change their password, or the administrator can do it for them. We've also got Spambot Detection, which is another feature that we recently added. And what this will do is it will look at the return path of mail coming in to your server. And if it finds that the same return path is used by multiple IP addresses, then it's possible that we have a Spambot at play. So, for example, by default, if 10 different IP addresses are used by the same return path in 10 minutes, then they'll be blacklisted. The return path will be blacklisted for a given number of minutes. And optionally, you can blacklist the offending IP address or IP addresses for a given number of minutes as well. Tarpitting. So tarpitting is a method of slowing down a connection once a given number of RCPT commands has been reached. So for example, some spammer is wanting to send spam to as many recipients as possible, and they put in 10, 15, 20 recipients. Well, you can help cut down on that activity by slowing down the connection. So for example, if the tarpit threshold is 5 recipients or 5 RCPT commands, then for each consecutive recipient, the connection will be delayed by 10 seconds. Notice the scaling factor. The scaling factor of 1 means that the number of seconds will not be multiplied for each consecutive delay. However, if you put a 1.5 in there, for example, then the first delay will be 10 seconds, the second delay will be 15 seconds, the third delay will be 22.5, and so forth. You just multiply each consecutive delay by 1.5. That can be an effective tool at discouraging spammers from sending through your server. And then we have Backscatter Protection. So Backscatter Protection will insert a hashed time-sensitive code to the return path of all outbound mail. When a bounce-back message is received, like a non-delivery NDR, non-delivery reply, or an out-of-office autoresponder, when MDaemon receives one of those, it will look for that code or that tag in the return path. If it's missing, then we know that the message return path had been forged, and that we're dealing with backscatter, and we can discard it accordingly. So this is a feature that we recommend enabling as well. It can help cut down on your users receiving lots of out-of-office autoresponders or bounce-back messages in response to messages that they never sent in the first place. So for the Trusted Hosts and IP screen, if you have any IP addresses listed in this section, you should be 100% sure that you know why they are listed and that they are 100% fully trusted. If a host or an IP gets added to this list by mistake, it can lead to an increase in spam. Now your logs will show when an email arrives from a trusted host or IP. So if you start to receive spam from a trusted host or IP, first of all, it will say it in your logs. And if that's the case, you can go and remove that entry from the trusted host list if it had been added here by mistake. Now, most spam messages come from spoofed addresses, and they'll be caught by most of MDaemon's spam filtering processes. Other types of spam messages include those annoying marketing emails or sales emails that may come in that come from legitimate sources. And for those, you can block those using the sender blacklist. You could, if you like, which might be more effective, you can blacklist the entire domain by using an asterisk in front of the domain like a wildcard. So if you find that you're suffering from a lot of false positives, then you want to check that you have not inadvertently blacklisted the sender's or the recipient's address in MDaemon's spam filter settings. So under the spam filter blacklist by sender, make sure that those addresses are not listed here if you're suffering from a lot of false positives. And after making the recommendations in this presentation, your users are still suffering from too much spam, then you should check to make sure that you've not inadvertently whitelisted or excluded the sender's or recipient's address from MDaemon's spam filter. You should also check that the spammer didn't manage to authenticate their SMTP session by guessing a local user's account password, and that their connection did not originate from a trusted or local IP address. And you can check this information by referring to the log files, the inbound SMTP log, the anti-spam log, and I also often would refer to the MDaemon all log file because it has a compilation of all of that activity in one log file. Also, if a lot of spam is still getting through, or if a lot of non-spam is being counted as spam, then you may need to rebuild your Bayesian learning database. Now to do this, you'll need to stop MDaemon and all of its processes, and then navigate to the MDaemon Spam Assassin directory and rename the Bayes folder. So you can call it Bayes old or something like that, and then restart MDaemon. Now at that time, a new Bayes folder will be created, but then you'll need to start over and feed the Bayesian spam and non-spam folders 200 samples of spam and non-spam messages each. At that time, Bayesian learning will take place. So this will allow you to refresh your Bayesian learning engine. So just to recap some of the things we talked about and some of the recommendations for best performance, we recommend, of course, using Security Plus, using Bayesian learning filter, direct SMTP delivery with a single MX record. Your spam scoring, of course, and remember the different thresholds for the SMTP and the queue-based scan. Use your blacklist and whitelist with caution. Use DNS blacklist and spam honeypots. Definitely make sure that you have relaying blocked to avoid being put on a blacklist. The IP shield can help you with that as well, and enabling the DKIM, DMARC, and requiring strong passwords and so forth. So also monitor your spam trap folder for any spam that may have been gotten through, so you can flag it for spam or release it for delivery. So those are the recommended settings for performance and security. And I am recording this, so this webinar will also be placed on our website at altn.com and on our YouTube channel. And if you have questions, feel free to email me anytime at training@altn.com. You can also use the chat feature if you have questions now, and then we'll make this recording available accordingly. So thanks for joining, and have a great day.